What if the cross was never mainly about a transaction? What if it was something closer to the furthest point of God entering the human condition? Not a payment made above us, but a descent made into us. Because for a lot of people, the way Christianity gets explained sounds almost mechanical. Humanity sins, God requires justice, Jesus pays the price, the debt clears and you go free. And let's be real, there is some solid ideas there. It says evil isn't waved away. It says grace costs something. It says what went wrong mattered enough to demand an answer. Those are true instincts, and I have no interest in losing them. But when that becomes the whole story, when the entire faith narrows to a single courtroom, the part that actually reaches the way people live falls out of frame. Here's what I'd put in its place. Christianity doesn't begin at the cross. It begins at the incarnation, with the claim that God entered human life, took on a body, and joined the creature from the inside. And where you begin decides what the cross can even mean. Start at the courtroom, and the cross is a payment. Start at the incarnation, and the cross becomes the deepest point of something that began the moment God became human. So, before anything gets transacted, something gets entered. Think about what the incarnation actually claims. Not God studying the human condition from a safe distance, but God stepping inside it, into a body that tires, into time that runs out, into hunger and grief and the slow weight of being a person, into being misunderstood, into being rejected by the people he came for, into a vulnerability that has no defense, and finally into death itself. That isn't a detail of the story. That is the architecture of the claim. God did not stay outside what it cost to be human. And the cross is where that entering goes all the way to the bottom. Not into the average difficulty of a life, but into its worst edge. Into shame, into violence done to an innocent body, into abandonment, the silence where even God seems to have gone, into the humiliation and pain and mortality that wait in some form for all of us. So when Christ goes there, he isn't standing in for humanity in some abstract legal sense. He's going to the precise place where being human breaks. And that matters because the human problem has never really felt legal. Most people don't move through their days feeling that their core wound is a rule they broke in some heavenly ledger. That isn't the texture of being alive. What they feel is fracture, divided against themselves, carrying shame they can't set down, wounded in places that never fully closed, trapped in patterns they swore they'd break and didn't. Estranged from themselves, from the people closest to them, sometimes from the God they're not sure is listening, and under all of it, the quiet awareness that death is somewhere in the room. That's the human condition, not a clerical error, a structural break in what it means to be a person. So if salvation is meant to touch the life you're actually living, it has to be larger than acquittal. It has to reach the structure, not just the record. Which is exactly why God doesn't answer that ruin with a verdict from across the room. God answers it by going down into it, to the bottom of the fracture, where the break actually is. Not around it, through it. And here is the thing I keep returning to, the part I don't think the courtroom version can hold. Once he's there, at the bottom, something happens that a transaction has no category for. Every distortion of the human condition gets poured onto one person. The cruelty, the betrayal, the rejection, the violence, and he doesn't pour it back. He takes the violence and returns none of it. He absorbs the abandonment without abandoning. The distortion comes in and it does not come back out. The pattern that has run through all of human history, harm answered with harm, reaches someone who refuses to pass it on. What ends there isn't a debt, it's the cycle of harm meeting the one place it cannot continue. And that is what makes the resurrection more than a receipt. He absorbed the worst the structure could do, and the structure could not hold him. So the resurrection becomes a declaration. Death does not own the last word. The fracture isn't final. Corruption and abandonment don't get to define the ending. Christ goes the whole way into the collapse and then reopens reality from the inside. Not repaired from above, reopened from within, at the exact point where it broke. Which changes what salvation even means. It's no longer only you are forgiven. though forgiveness genuinely matters. It becomes closer to you are being restored. Salvation becomes repair, not just release from a penalty, restoration of a structure that came apart, not just a verdict, a rebuilding. And repair has a texture you can actually recognize. It looks like the pattern you swore you'd break, and then one ordinary morning you simply don't repeat it. And it isn't even a fight. It looks like the shame you carried for years, until one day you notice you've set it down and can't say exactly when. It looks like meeting the eyes of someone you'd spent a long time unable to face. The wound might still be there, but it has stopped running you. That's repair, not the absence of the break, but the break no longer holding the controls. And that's why sin was never just law-breaking. Sin deforms everything I described before: the division, the shame you can't set down, the patterns you can't break, the estrangement from the people closest to you. None of it is separate from sin. That's what sin does. It's the shape sin leaves in a person. So whatever salvation is, it can't be smaller than that damage. A pardon that cleared the record but left you exactly as fractured as it found you was never going to reach far enough. If sin reaches the whole shape of a person, salvation has to reach at least as far. That's also why this asks us to imagine holiness differently. We tend to picture holiness as distance, purity kept safe by separation. But here's a holiness that walks into the worst conditions a creature can know and is not diminished by them. Holiness strong enough to descend and stay itself the whole way down. A different kind of love, a different kind of rescue. Once you see Christ as God entering the full architecture of human existence, the cross stops looking like a detached legal mechanism. It starts looking like the deepest act of divine solidarity in the history of the world. God doesn't stand at a distance from suffering and explain it. God enters it. God doesn't remain outside death and pronounce over it. God passes through it and comes out the far side, so that your humanity isn't left abandoned in the fracture but rebuilt from the inside out, the same direction the resurrection moves. And that leaves us with a better question than the one we usually ask. Not only how does the cross pay for sin, but this: if God was willing to enter the full structure of being human, all the way down to suffering and death, in order to restore it from the inside, then what does that ask of the way you carry your own fractures, knowing there isn't one of them he refused to go into?